Step away from the door, hands where I can see them, now." The voice came through a PA system, amplified and cold, the kind of voice designed to end arguments before they start, and it hit James Calloway full in the face along with the spotlight so bright it turned the October night into something resembling noon. He didn't flinch. He had learned over 51 years of living in this country that flinching was the one thing you could not afford when a light like that found you. His hands came up slowly, palms open, facing forward. The gesture was so practiced it lived somewhere below conscious thought, not submission, not performance, just the careful, deliberate language of a black man in America communicating the one thing that mattered in this particular moment. I am not a threat. I am not moving fast. I see you seeing me. The screwdriver was still in his right hand. He set it down on the porch railing with the kind of unhurried, visible slowness that leaves no room for misinterpretation. The small, flathead tool, the kind you find at gas stations, the kind he had carried in his jacket pocket since his days fixing up old Chevys in his uncle's driveway in Evanston, touched the painted wood of the railing and made almost no sound at all. He turned to face the light. Behind it, two silhouettes. One advancing up the walkway with the particular kinetic certainty of a man who has already decided how this ends. The other fanning wide to the right hand, resting on a holstered sidearm, moving with the slightly too deliberate caution of someone newer to this, someone who was still performing confidence rather than possessing it. The patrol car had hopped the curb. James noticed that. He filed it away the way he filed everything quietly, completely, without letting the filings show on his face. The front door of 417 Sycamore Ridge Drive was 3 feet behind him, and it was locked. Not locked because he had locked it. Locked because the state-of-the-art smart lock system, the one the previous owners had installed and the one James had been perfectly content to inherit, had chosen this particular evening, at this particular moment, to malfunction. The keypad had blinked red when he came back up the porch steps with the package from the edge of the property. He had tapped his code. Red. He had tapped it again. Red. He had crouched down, found the small flathead in his jacket, and begun the 30-second process of popping the battery casing free for a reset. He had been a homeowner for 3 days. The October air smelled of wood smoke from somewhere down the block, and beneath that the smell of fresh paint and cedar coming from inside his own house, the warm, specific smell of a new beginning of boxes half unpacked of a life in the process of settling into a new shape. He could smell it through the crack under the door. He was not going to get to smell it from inside for a little while yet. "I said step down from the porch. Do it now." The officer in front was closer now. Close enough that James could see the name on the badge catching the spillover light from the cruiser's spotlight. Dodd. G. Dodd. He filed that too. "Good evening, officers," James said. His voice was calm. Not the tight, effortful calm of a man trying very hard not to seem afraid, but the genuinely level calm of a man who has spent 2 decades in courtrooms and has learned to make his voice do exactly what he needs it to do regardless of what the rest of him is feeling. It resonated in the quiet street the way a well-tuned instrument resonates clearly with no tremor in it, filling the space between him and the approaching officer without either shrinking from it or crowding it. He took one slow step down from the top porch step. One step. He was showing compliance. He was not going to the ground. "There's no problem here," he said. "I live at this address. I'm fixing a malfunctioning lock on my own front door." He did not look at the figure across the street. He had seen her 30 seconds ago, a movement in the curtain of the house directly opposite, then a figure emerging onto the porch phone, raised binoculars still in one hand. He had seen her the way you see something peripheral that your brain files under relevant before the conscious mind catches up. He did not look at her now because looking at her would acknowledge something he was not ready to acknowledge yet. The second officer, younger name Patch, reading Cole, had stopped about 15 feet to James's right. His hand had moved from his sidearm. He was watching Dodd, not James, with an expression that James recognized as the expression of someone waiting to see what they were supposed to do. Dodd reached the bottom of the porch steps and stopped. "ID," he said. Just the word. No please, no sir, no preamble. The word delivered the way you hand something to someone you don't respect. "My wallet is in my back right pocket," James said. My driver's license will show this address. Do I have your permission to reach for it? Slowly. James reached back, withdrew the wallet, opened it to the license, and held it out. Dodd looked at it. For exactly 3 seconds, Dodd looked at the Illinois driver's license of James Elliott Calloway, with the address 417 Sycamore Ridge Drive printed in clean black type, and then he pocketed the wallet. Pocketed it, did not hand it back, did not read the address aloud to his partner, and said, "Get down the stairs, hands interlaced behind your head." "I've identified myself," James said. His voice hadn't changed. "My license confirms this address. If you check the property records, I'm not asking again." The red malfunction light on the smart lock blinked behind him. Once, twice. James looked at Officer Dodd for one long, measured moment, the same look he used in the courtrooms when a witness said something that revealed more than they intended, and then he descended the remaining steps. Sycamore Ridge was the kind of neighborhood that costs enough to feel permanent. The oaks lining the street were old enough to have been there before most of the houses, their roots quietly lifting the edges of the sidewalk in a way that the Homeowners Association perpetually discussed but never quite got around to fixing. The driveways held vehicles that cost more than some people's annual salaries. The porch lights came on at dusk via sensors, and the neighborhood watch signs had been recently replaced new laminate, bright reflective lettering. James had chosen this address the way he chose everything in his professional life, with specific, deliberate intent. He had spent 20 years in public law. Federal public defender, then civil rights litigator out of Springfield, then a senior position with the state's Civil Rights Division. When the AG's office called with the appointment Special Prosecutor with a mandate to conduct an independent review of law enforcement accountability, in the greater Millhaven metropolitan area, he had sat in his old apartment for a full evening, thinking about where to live. Not for comfort, for proximity. The Millhaven Police Department's jurisdiction extended through 6 suburban municipalities. Sycamore Ridge was inside it. He had read the Tillman Haverford audit, the internal review that the department had buried 2 years ago, detailing patterns in traffic stop data and questions about the evidence locker, and he had understood that he was not being sent to Millhaven to review abstract statistics. He was being sent because people lived inside those statistics, and those people deserved someone willing to stand in the same streets they stood in. He had not planned to stand in them quite this way, quite this soon, but here he was. Porch lights were beginning to flicker on down the block, 1, then 3, then 6. A slow wave of illumination that moved up and down Sycamore Ridge Drive as neighbors drawn by the sound of the cruiser's engine and the flood of the spotlight came to their windows and then to their doorways. James was aware of phones being raised. He was aware of the recording that was almost certainly already happening on multiple devices simultaneously. He was also aware of Officer Dodd, who had his wallet. "Officers," James said, standing at the bottom of his porch steps with his hands still elevated, "I am the homeowner at this address. I purchased this property 3 weeks ago, and I have lived here for 3 days. My driver's license, which you are currently holding, lists this address. I would like to walk back up my porch steps, open my door, and show you the property deed, which is in a box in my front hallway." Dodd's response was a sound not quite a laugh, not quite a scoff. Something in between the specific sound of a man who has decided a story is funny before he's heard the end of it. "Yeah, right," he said. "Homeowner." And here was the thing about those 2 words. The thing that James's 2 decades in law instantly recognized and cataloged, those 2 words were not a question. They were not an expression of doubt that could be resolved with evidence. They were a verdict, rendered before the evidence was examined. Rendered, in fact, instead of examining the evidence. He understood in that moment that showing Dodd the deed would not help him. What it would do was go on the dash cam. The dash cam on Dodd's cruiser was recording. The body cam on Dodd's chest was recording. Cole's body cam was recording. The phones of at least 4 of his neighbors were recording. And Dodd, who was standing in the driveway of the newly appointed Special Prosecutor for the Illinois State Attorney General's office, a man whose specific mandate was the review of this police department, was on all of those recordings saying, Yeah, right, homeowner, and pocketing the driver's license without reading it. James filed all of this. Ground, Dodd said. Down on your knees, hands behind your head, fingers interlaced. I am complying with your verbal commands, James said, steady as a heartbeat. And I am identifying myself as the legal resident of this property. I am not going to kneel in my own yard. I will stand here with my hands raised and I will answer any question you have. From across the street, a voice, bright, self-pleased, carrying the particular satisfaction of someone who believes they have done the neighborhood a service. Officers, right there, that's him. That's the one I called about. She was a woman in her early 60s wearing a quilted floral robe crossing her own driveway toward the street with the brisk, purposeful stride of someone arriving to receive credit. Her phone was still in her hand. Her chin was up. James looked at her for exactly 1 second. He did not let whatever he was feeling reach his face. He turned back to Officer Dodd and he said very quietly, "Her name and contact information should go in your report. I will need it." What happened next took 11 seconds. James knew this because the dashcam timestamp would later confirm it, and because he counted not obsessively, not frantically, but with the same methodical precision that had kept him functional through 20 years of the most difficult work the law contained. 1. Dodd closed the distance between them in 3 strides. 2. Dodd's left hand closed around James's left arm above the elbow, not the careful guiding grip of a lawful detention, but the sudden wrenching grab of a man escalating past the point of reason. 3. James stumbled forward. His foot caught the edge of the driveway where the concrete met the grass. He did not fall. His body was broader and heavier than Dodd had apparently calculated for, but he pitched forward enough that Dodd could narrate it as resistance, which was exactly the point. 4. Stop resisting. The phrase landed in the night air with the hollow ring of something rehearsed. Something pulled from a script that had been used so many times in so many driveways that the words had worn smooth like stones in a river, worn down to the point where they meant nothing except, "I am establishing a justification." "I am not resisting," James said. His voice was slightly muffled now because Dodd had a hand on the back of his neck and was steering him toward the hood of the Mercedes. "You are assaulting me on my own property." Cole arrived on his other side. The 2 officers moved together and they shoved the 51-year-old man, the special prosecutor for the Illinois State Attorney General's office, the man who had moved into this house 72 hours ago. The man who had been trying to fix a lock on his own front door, face first into the hood of his own charcoal gray Mercedes-Benz. The cold metal came up to meet his cheek. The air went out of him. He could feel the October chill radiating off the car's surface, the specific biting cold of metal that has been sitting in the night air for hours, pressing into the side of his face, into his chest, into the wrists that Dodd was now pulling behind his back with the particular force of a man in a hurry. The handcuffs closed. 1 ratchet, 2, 3. Each tooth clicking into the lock with that specific mechanical sound, not loud, never as loud as you'd think, but precise, definitive. The sound of a door being shut. He was aware of his neighbors watching. He was aware of Patricia Howell standing at the edge of his driveway with her arms crossed and a small, satisfied expression on her face watching the police handle the threat she had identified. He was aware of Cole, who had stepped back slightly, whose eyes kept moving from Dodd's hands to the phones being held up along the street, whose expression had shifted from performed confidence to something that looked at close range like unease. Dodd was going through his jacket pockets now. He found the wallet. He pulled it out, opened. It looked at the driver's license inside the one with the address printed in clear black letters, the one that said 417 Sycamore Ridge Drive, and he said to Cole without lowering his voice with the casual certainty of a man who believes he is not being recorded in any meaningful way, "These guys always have a story." He put the wallet back in his own pocket. James pressed against the hood of his own car, his cheek against the cold metal, the red malfunction light of his smart lock still blinking above him on his own front door, heard those words with absolute clarity. He filed them. He could see from this angle the red light blinking in an even rhythm. 3 blinks, pause. 3 blinks, pause. It had been malfunctioning for 7 minutes. He had been a homeowner on Sycamore Ridge Drive for 3 days, and the thought that came to him clear and calm and completely unperformed because there was nobody to perform it, for it was just the truth of what he was thinking, was this is exactly what I came here to find. He did not know yet everything that would follow from this moment. He did not know about the precinct sergeant or the chief's dinner, or the morning that was coming, or the press conference that would transform this quiet suburban street into the center of something much larger than one man's driveway. He didn't know any of that yet. But he knew what he had, and he knew what it was worth. He breathed. The red light blinked, and he waited. They put him in the back of the patrol car, not gently, not roughly. With the brisk, impersonal efficiency of men who have done this many times and long since stopped thinking about what it means to the person on the receiving end, the way a factory worker handles a component, not with malice but with the complete absence of recognition that what they are handling is a human being who is aware of being handled. James folded himself into the back seat, wrists still bound behind him, the cuffs sitting high and tight, and he sat with his back as straight as the confined space allowed, and he looked out through the reinforced partition at the street. Dodd and Cole were standing outside the car arguing in low voices. He could see their body language through the glass but could not hear the words. Dodd was doing most of the talking, loose-limbed and dismissive, still carrying the swagger of a man who believes the situation is entirely under his control. Cole was standing with his weight shifted back, arms folded, and James had been reading Bodies in Courtrooms for long enough to know that Cole's posture was not agreement. It was the posture of someone who was waiting for the right moment to create distance between themselves and what had just happened. Good, James thought. A neighbor, a man he had not yet met, heavy-set wearing a Cardinals sweatshirt, had walked down to the edge of his own property and was speaking to Cole. The neighbor was pointing at his phone. Cole walked over to him, said something, and the neighbor shook his head and kept filming. James took note of every phone. He took note of which neighbors had come outside and which had stayed inside. He took note of Patricia Howell, who had moved back to the edge of his property and was now watching with the slightly less triumphant expression of a woman who has realized that the climax she expected hasn't arrived yet. He took note of the angle of Dodd's body cam. He took note of the position of the cruiser's dash cam. And then, because he had nothing else to do with the next stretch of time, and because the work was always the work regardless of where you were sitting, he thought. He thought about Franklin Moore, his supervisor at the AG's office, who had called him 2 weeks before the move and said quietly, in the way that Moore said important things without volume, without dramatics, just with the particular weight of a man who had learned to conserve energy and deploy truth, "James, this department has a record. Watch yourself." He had said it the way you say something to someone you know doesn't need to be told, but you're going to tell them anyway because that's what you do for people you've been watching over for a long time. He thought about the 3 weeks before the move. He had spent those weeks at a desk in Springfield reading. The Tillman Haverford audit was 143 pages long, and it had been completed by an internal review team that had done genuinely good work. Careful work, documented work. The kind of work that takes months and leaves nothing vague, and then it had been handed to Chief Robert Weston, and Weston had buried it. The audit documented 2 things in particular. The first was a pattern in traffic stop data. Black drivers in 6 Millhaven area municipalities were stopped at a rate 4 times higher than white drivers, with citation rates that did not reflect the stop rates, meaning the stops were not producing the arrests or citations that would justify them as law enforcement activity. They were producing something else, something the data couldn't name, but the people who lived through them could. The second was the evidence locker. $38,000 moved out of the narcotics evidence locker over 14 months in amounts small enough to avoid triggering automatic review flags. Captain Dale Pruitt's name was in the audit twice. Weston's name was in it once in connection with a meeting in which the audit's findings were discussed and a decision was made about how to handle them. The decision had been to handle them by not handling them. James had chosen 417 Sycamore Ridge Drive because it was inside the Millhaven PD's jurisdiction. He had not manufactured what was happening tonight, but he had been ready for the possibility of something like it in the same way that a prepared person is always ready for the thing they hope won't happen but understand might. And when it did happen, he had felt underneath the cold and the indignity and the biting metal of the cuffs on his wrists, something that he would not have called satisfaction exactly, but that was in the vicinity of recognition. The recognition of a pattern making itself visible in a way that could not be denied. He had the body cam footage, he had the dash cam, he had the neighbors' phones. He had, "These guys always have a story," on audio in Dodd's own voice while Dodd was holding a driver's license that confirmed the man he was arresting lived at the address they were standing in front of. He breathed slowly in the back of the patrol car, wrists aching, cheeks still carrying the ghost of the cold metal hood. And he thought about what he had learned in 20 years of civil rights law, which was that the law had never in his experience been a knight on a horse. It was more like water. It found its way through cracks slowly over time, and it was most effective when you understood that patience was not passivity. Patience was preparation with a longer timeline. He was patient. He was also sitting in the back of Gary Dodd's patrol car on a Tuesday night in October, genuinely furious in that deep, cold, completely private way that never reaches the face, the way fury becomes fuel when it has nowhere else to go. He was furious for himself. He was furious for Darnell Shaw, whose name was in the audit's traffic stop appendix 11 times. He was furious for Renee Baxter 40 minutes in a parking lot and for Troy Ellison 2 hours on the shoulder of a road the night before his first college exam. He was furious in a way that was going to be useful. The thing about the booking process at any precinct is that it begins before the suspect arrives. It begins with a name called in over the radio or logged into the system during the pre-arrival check, and what that name returns or doesn't return shapes the conversation that happens when the suspect walks through the door. The sergeant at the Millhaven precinct desk that night was a 22-year veteran named Charlie Britton, a compact, careful man with reading glasses on a beaded chain who had seen enough walk through that door to have lost most of his capacity for surprise. He ran the name from the radio check, James Elliott Calloway, black male 51, through the standard system. The result that came back was not a criminal record. It was a state employment file flagged as active, marked with a department code that Britton had not seen attached to an incoming arrest in his entire career. He looked at it for a moment with his glasses pushed up his nose. Then he looked at it again. Then he picked up the radio. "Car 14, this is dispatch. I need you to confirm the name on your detainee." In the front seat of the patrol car, Dodd reached into his pocket, pulled out the wallet he had never handed back, and read the name off the driver's license. The silence from the radio lasted 3 full seconds. "Gary." Britton's voice was very controlled. "Do not bring him in. Do not move the vehicle. I am calling the chief." Dodd held the radio handset and looked at the license in his other hand. Cole in the passenger seat turned and looked at him. Something was changing in the air inside the car, the specific pressure shift of a moment when the frame of reference for an entire situation suddenly tilts and what seemed stable begins to creak. Dodd could feel it, and he didn't yet understand what was causing it, which was in its own way worse than understanding. He pulled out his personal phone. He typed the name into the search bar. The first result was from the Illinois Attorney General's press release dated 6 weeks ago. James Elliott Calloway, appointed Special Prosecutor Office of the Illinois Attorney General. Mr. Calloway will lead an independent accountability review of selected law enforcement agencies in the greater Millhaven metropolitan area, with full subpoena authority and federal reporting obligations. The phone settled slowly onto Dodd's knee. Cole was watching him. James in the back seat watching both of them in the rearview mirror with his back straight and his expression entirely neutral, saw the moment the color changed in Dodd's face, saw the specific physiological sequence of it, the jaw setting, the throat moving, the stillness that replaced the loose-limbed swagger, and he said nothing. He had nothing to say that the dashcam wasn't already saying for him. Meanwhile, 8 miles away in the private dining room of a restaurant called Harrington's Darkwood Low Light, the kind of place where local officials ate when they needed to be seen. Being quiet, Chief Robert Weston was midway through a conversation about the department's budget presentation when his personal cell phone vibrated. He looked at the screen. He didn't recognize the number, but he recognized the precinct exchange, and Charlie Britton only called the chief's personal cell when something had happened that could not travel through official channels without first being prepared for. He excused himself from the table. He walked through the restaurant's side hallway to the coat room, and he answered the call. What Britton told him in the measured information-dense way that experienced police personnel deliver bad news took 45 seconds. Weston listened without interrupting. When Britton finished, there was a silence that lasted about as long as it takes to understand something that cannot be ununderstood. Weston said, "Don't log the booking." He walked back through the restaurant, past his table, past his colleagues who looked up expecting him to sit back down, and he said, "Something's come up." And he retrieved his jacket from the back of his chair, and he walked out into the parking lot and got into his personal vehicle. His hands went to the steering wheel at 10 and 2. He pulled out of the parking lot and pointed the car towards Sycamore Ridge. The drive was 9 minutes. He did not use a siren. He did not call anyone. He sat in the driver's seat with his jaw set and both hands on the wheel and the particular kind of nausea that is not physical. The nausea of a man watching the architecture of a decade's worth of decisions begin all at once to show its load-bearing weakness. Back on Sycamore Ridge, Patricia Howell was still at the edge of James's driveway, but her stance had changed. The arms that had been crossed in satisfaction were now folded differently tighter closer to her body. The police car had not moved in 12 minutes. The officers were not processing anything. They were just sitting. A neighbor from 3 houses north walked over and said something to her. Patricia looked at him, then at the car, then back at him. Her smile had not entirely gone, but it had begun to look like something she was working to maintain. Weston's personal car. A dark blue Chevy Tahoe, a few years old. The kind of vehicle a chief of police drives when he is not driving a department vehicle and wants to convey that he is a regular person, which he has not pulled, onto Sycamore Ridge Drive at 8:31 p.m. and parked with one wheel up on the curb in a way that suggested he had not been paying attention to the parking when he stopped. He stepped out. He was in his dinner clothes, a navy blazer, charcoal slacks, a white dress shirt with the top button open, the open collar of a man who left somewhere comfortable in a hurry and didn't stop to change. He walked up the driveway at the specific pace of a man who is trying to look unhurried and failing. And he saw James Calloway standing beside the patrol car, wrists behind his back marked red lines, already visible where the cuffs had been, and something in Weston's stride broke. Not dramatically. He didn't stumble, but there was a half step, a micro-hesitation, the physiological equivalent of a man hitting a wall he had been told was there but had not quite believed in until the moment of contact. He collected himself. He looked at Dodd. The look he gave Gary Dodd standing 2 feet away, visibly rigid, the swagger of 2 hours ago, completely evacuated from his posture, was the kind of look that does not require words. It was the look of a man watching a decade of careful management turn into rubble in real time, and all of the fury in it was entirely secondary to the much larger and more consuming recognition of what had been done and what it was going to cost. "The keys," Weston said. His voice was low. Not a rasp, not a bark. Low in the way that things that carry genuine menace are usually quiet. Dodd's hands went to his duty belt, and they were not steady. The key was in a small leather pouch on the belt, and getting it out should have taken 2 seconds. And instead, it took 7. And in those 7 seconds, his fingers fumbled twice, and on the second fumble the key dropped from his hand and hit the concrete driveway with a sound that was in the silence of that street at that moment startlingly crisp and clear. He scrambled to pick it up. He straightened, face-pale sweat beading at his hairline despite the October chill, and he extended the key toward Weston, and his hand was shaking enough that Weston had to reach forward and close his own hand around Dodd's to get a grip on it. Weston stepped behind James. "Mr. Calloway," he said. His voice, now directed at James, was different. The contempt pulled out of it and replaced with the specific cadence of a man performing control while deeply afraid. "Sir, I'm removing these now." The key went in. Click, click. The steel jaws opened. James brought his arms forward slowly, and he stood for a moment with his hands in front of him, just looking at his own wrists, the deep red indentations circling each one already beginning to darken at the edges, the particular marks of metal applied too tightly for too long. He rubbed them, methodically. Not fast, not dramatically, just the careful circular motion of a man restoring circulation to his own hands while a police chief stood 2 feet behind him and waited. Then James turned around. He looked at Weston, and then at Dodd, and then at Cole, and the three of them arranged in his driveway looked back at him, and the balance of every single thing in that exchange had inverted completely from what it had been 40 minutes ago. "Chief Callahan," James said, and then corrected himself without missing a beat. The correction smooth and untroubled, simply accurate. "Chief Weston, I assume you're aware of who I am." "Yes, sir," Weston said. "I am." "Then I need you to understand something clearly, and I need you to understand it in plain terms because I want the body cams to capture it without ambiguity." He adjusted the cuffs of his cashmere sweater. The gesture was unhurried, and complete the gesture of a man who is at home in whatever space he occupies regardless of what has just been done to him in it. "This was not a misunderstanding," he said. "A misunderstanding is a misread house number. A misunderstanding is a respectful inquiry resolved by a 2-second review of a driver's license. What occurred here tonight was a warrantless detention on my own property, a refusal to examine identifying documentation that was voluntarily offered physical assault, false imprisonment, and battery. Those are not misunderstandings. Those are violations of the Fourth Amendment, and they are federal civil rights violations, and they happened while at least 7 of my neighbors were recording on their personal devices, and they happened on the dash cam of that vehicle, and they happened on the body cam currently attached to Officer Dodd's chest." Dodd, behind Weston, took a step backward. James did not look at him. His eyes stayed on Weston. "I will be expecting termination paperwork for Officer Dodd and Officer Cole to be on my desk by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning," he said. "I will also be expecting a written commitment to a civilian oversight structure with independent subpoena authority co-signed by you and the mayor. We will discuss the other elements of what I require when we speak inside." He raised one hand, open palm calm, as a held breath, and stopped Weston before the chief could respond. Because from the edge of the driveway came Patricia Howell. She was walking with the bright, purpose-filled stride of a woman arriving to receive confirmation that she was right. Her quilted robe had been cinched tighter around her waist. Her phone was clutched against her chest. She had seen the chief arrive, and she had interpreted his arrival as validation the cavalry come to wrap up what she had set in motion. "Officers," she said, and her voice carried that particular note of civic self-congratulation that James had heard many times in many courtrooms from many witnesses who had no idea how badly they were about to damage their own position. "I'm the one who called. I saw him at that door with a tool, and I knew something was wrong, and I am so glad you all responded so quickly." She looked at James with the expression people use when they are trying to convey that they have nothing against a person personally, while also making clear that they have acted entirely in accordance with their judgment of that person. James looked at her with the terrifyingly calm, polite expression of a man who has been holding something for 40 minutes and is deciding exactly how to set it down. "Good evening, ma'am," he said. His voice was pleasant, even warm. "I'm James Calloway. I purchased this property 3 weeks ago. I moved in on Tuesday." Patricia blinked. The bright certainty in her face flickered, not gone yet, but cracked the way ice cracks before it gives way, the way you can see in the fissure the full collapse that is coming even before it arrives. That's not possible," she said. "The Hendersons moved out. I didn't see any trucks. My relocation was handled privately," James said, "due to the nature of my position with the state. I didn't have a public moving day." He paused. He tilted his head slightly the way a very good attorney tilts his head when the witness has just handed him exactly what he needs. "You called 911 and reported a burglary in progress. You described a man with a tool at a front door. You did not approach the property, you did not speak to the person, and you did not wait for a non-emergency response to verify your assumption before escalating to an emergency dispatch." Patricia opened her mouth. "The 911 recording will be subpoenaed," James said. "Your name and contact information need to be in Officer Dodd's report. You are now a material witness in a federal civil rights inquiry, and I intend to explore civil litigation against you personally for providing a false emergency report that resulted in my physical injury." The phone she was clutching to her chest, the phone she had used to make the call, the phone she had been holding like a trophy began to feel by the look on her face like something considerably less triumphant. She made a small sound. She turned around and walked back across the street at a pace considerably faster than the one she had arrived with, the quilted robe disappearing back into her own house, the door closing. James turned back to Weston. "Inside," he said. "Now." The smart lock glowed green. The interior of 417 Sycamore Ridge Drive was quiet and clean, and still in the process of becoming itself. The previous owners had left behind good bones, dark hardwood floors, vaulted ceilings in the main room windows that in daylight would show the backyard's October oaks in the full copper and amber of their turning. Tonight, the windows held the dark and the reflection of a single kitchen lamp, and the rooms smelled of fresh paint and cedar, and beneath both the faint paper and must smell of books that have lived in boxes for too long and are ready to come out. James's books were in 7 boxes stacked along the near wall. The movers had offered to shelve them. He had declined. He shelved his own books. That was personal. On the wall opposite to the kitchen already hung. Because this was the one thing he had unpacked first, was a framed photograph. A woman in her mid-50s, small and straight-backed, wearing her good church clothes, a dark blue dress, white gloves, a hat with a small silk flower standing on the limestone steps of a courthouse. She was smiling at whoever was holding the camera with the specific smile of a woman who has done something worth smiling about and knows it. That was his mother, Estelle Calloway. The courthouse was in Chicago. Chief Weston did not know any of this. He stood in the foyer in his dinner blazer, distinctly out of place among the artifacts of a life built entirely inside the law, and he looked like a man who had sat down on a chair that was smaller than he expected and was trying not to show it. James crossed to the kitchen island without looking at him. He poured a glass of sparkling water from a bottle in the refrigerator. He took one long, deliberate sip. He set the glass down. He did not offer Weston anything. He did not ask Weston to sit. On the kitchen island already open, was a manila folder. This detail, the folder already prepared, landed on Weston, the way things land when their full significance arrives slightly after the initial contact, the way you sometimes don't feel the impact of a fall until you try to stand up. The folder had been there before tonight happened, which meant James Calloway had been working before tonight happened. James opened the folder without hurry. "I'm going to tell you exactly what I need from you by 9 a.m. tomorrow," he said. "I'm going to tell you plainly because I want you to understand it and because I'm not interested in legal theater. I'm interested in outcomes." Weston was very still. "The first thing I need is the termination of Officer Gary Dodd, effective immediately, with full documentation of the grounds which are warrantless detention, excessive force battery, and failure to perform basic evidentiary due diligence during a residential call. Not a suspension. Not an administrative leave pending review. Termination." Weston started to speak. James continued. "The second thing I need is a signed commitment from you and from the mayor to establish a civilian oversight board for the Millhaven PD, staffed by residents of the affected communities with independent subpoena authority and mandatory quarterly public reporting. This is not a new idea. 14 other Illinois departments operate under versions of this structure. I will have the template documents on your desk within the hour." The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. "The third thing," James said, and he looked up from the folder and looked directly at Weston for the first time since they had come inside, "is full cooperation with a state audit of this department's traffic enforcement data and evidence handling procedures for the past 4 years. Something changed in Weston's face. It was not a dramatic change. It was the change of a man recognizing a name, not a name spoken aloud, not yet, but the shape of a name, the outline of it visible in the specific way James had described the audit's scope. "You know about the Tillman Haverford report," Weston said. "I've read it," James said, "all 143 pages." Weston put one hand on the back of the kitchen chair nearest to him. He didn't pull it out to sit. He just held it the way you hold something for stability, and for a moment he looked not like a corrupt official or an institutional protector, but simply like a man who is very tired and has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. "I thought I was protecting the department," he said. "I know you did," James said. His voice was not warm exactly, but it was not without understanding. He had heard some version of this in enough rooms from enough people to know that it was almost always true that the men who buried audits and covered for colleagues and turned institutional loyalty into something that replaced public accountability almost never thought of themselves as corrupt. They thought of themselves as pragmatic, as protectors, as the steady hand that kept the complicated machine running, somewhere between protecting the department and protecting the public. James said, "You forgot that the second one was the job, and the first one was supposed to be in service of it. That's the whole story, Chief. That's always the whole story." Weston was quiet for a moment. Then he said very quietly, with something genuine underneath it, "I thought I was a good cop." "Maybe you were," James said. "I'm not here to decide that. I'm here to decide what comes next for the people your department has been working against while you were busy protecting it." He walked to the front door and opened it. The night air came in cool, carrying the wood smoke from down the block, the smell of turning leaves. Dodd and Cole were still at the end of the driveway, standing beside the patrol car waiting. "You have until 9 a.m., James said. "I would recommend using the drive home to think carefully about what cooperation looks like and what its alternative looks like, because by the time you pull out of this driveway, those are the only two options remaining." Weston walked to the door. He stopped in the threshold and he looked at James, one long, complicated look, the look of a man trying to find something that might change the math and finding that the math is complete, and then he walked down the porch steps and down the driveway toward Gary Dodd. James watched. He watched Weston stop in front of Dodd. He watched Weston extend his hand, palm up. He watched Dodd unclip his badge and place it there, then his weapon. James closed the door. The smart lock clicked. The light went green. He stood in his own hallway in the quiet of a house that still smelled like someone else's life, in the company of his mother's photograph and 7 boxes of books, and the particular profound silence that follows the kind of day that changes things, and he breathed. Just breathed. The overnight shift at a police precinct has its own specific atmosphere, the fluorescent lights that never quite achieve warmth. The smell of burned coffee that has been sitting in the pot since 11 p.m. The industrial floor cleaner that gets applied every morning at 5:30 and dries to a faint chemical undertone that mingles with the ozone smell of old electronics and the particular staleness of air that has been recycled through the same building for decades. At 6:15 in the morning, the bullpen was mostly empty, night shift. Winding down, day shift not yet arrived, the precinct in the specific in-between state of an institution changing guard. The lights in Chief Robert Weston's glass-walled office were on, which was visible from anywhere in the bullpen, and through the glass you could see 4 men arranged around the heavy oak desk in the attitudes of men having a conversation nobody wanted to be having. Gary Dodd, stripped of his duty belt but still in uniform, the absence of the belt making him look oddly diminished like a door that's been taken off its hinges, was pacing. Short circuits back and forth in front of the window. The pacing of a man who cannot be still, because stillness would require him to fully inhabit the position he was in. Tom Briggs, president of the Millhaven Police Benevolent Association, had the kind of physical presence that came from years of occupying space in rooms where he believed his presence was the most important thing. In them, thick-necked, red-faced, sitting in the chair across from Weston's desk, with the posture of a man who had come to solve a problem and was still operating on the assumption that the problem was solvable by the means he was used to using. Against the filing cabinet, arms crossed, stood Captain Dale Pruitt. He had not sat down, he had not spoken yet. He held his position with the stillness of a man whose primary concern in any room, in any conversation, was to reveal as little as possible, and whose silence was not the silence of someone with nothing to say, but of someone who was deciding very carefully what to say and when. Pruitt's name was in the Tillman Haverford audit twice. He had known since the audit was buried that this day was possible. He had simply believed the way you believe in the persistence of luck. When luck has been persistent, that possible was different from inevitable. Weston sat behind his desk and looked 10 years older than he had at dinner the night before. He had not slept. This was visible in every line of his face and the particular flatness of his eyes and the way his hands rested on the desk. Not with the deliberate stillness of control, but with the involuntary stillness of exhaustion. He explained Calloway's 3 demands to the room. He explained them plainly and completely without softening them or reframing them, because there was no version of softening or reframing that would make them land differently from how they landed. Which was, the man they had arrested last night had the authority, the evidence, and the clear intent to dismantle this department from the top down, and the only question was whether they were going to attempt to fight that or cooperate with it, and either option was going to be painful. Briggs's response was immediate and entirely predictable. It was the response of a man who had built his institutional power on the premise that the Union was an immovable object, that solidarity was the ultimate protection, that any external challenge to how the department operated could be met with collective resistance and political pressure. "You're going to let some suit from the AG's office come into this town," Briggs said, his voice carrying the flat, hammer-heavy authority of someone used to being the loudest person in a room, "and dictate our personnel decisions and mandate civilian oversight over a bruised wrist? Absolutely not. The Union walks by noon if you sign anything." "It isn't a bruised wrist, Tom," Weston said. His voice had no energy in it. "It's a false arrest. It's battery on a federal official actively engaged in the review of this department, and it happened on 3 body cams and 7 cell phones, while the officer in question failed to examine identifying documentation that was voluntarily offered. He resisted. He did not resist. He told Dodd he was the homeowner, offered his wallet twice, and Gary put him against the hood of his own car while the driver's license in his pocket showed his address as the property they were standing in front of." Dodd stopped pacing. "He was aggressive," Dodd said. His voice had a different quality than it had on the driveway. The swagger was gone, and what remained in its absence was something smaller and harder. The defensive posture of a man who knew the story wasn't working, but hadn't yet found a better one. "The neighbor called it in as a burglary. We responded in good faith. Any judge in the county throws out his civil suit. He doesn't need a county judge," Weston said. He rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture of complete exhaustion. Unself-conscious, the gesture of a man past the point of performing composure. "He has FBI contacts and federal standing and the full weight of the AG's office behind him. And he already has the Tillman Haverford audit." The room changed. It was not a loud change. It was the change that happens when a specific name, a specific document, is introduced into a conversation where everyone in the room already knows exactly what that name means, and has been hoping on some level that it would not be the name that was introduced. Pruitt straightened. The movement was subtle, a shift in weight, a slight change in the set of his shoulders, but in someone who had been as deliberately still as Pruitt, it was the equivalent of a shout. His eyes had changed, and what was in them now was not the careful calculation of before, but something rawer and less managed. Briggs looked at Pruitt. Briggs looked at Weston. The bravado in his face did not disappear all at once. It deflated the way air leaves a tire, the slow resignation of a structure losing what was holding it up. He had come into this office believing he was here to flex institutional muscle. He was now understanding in real time that the problem in this room was significantly larger than a union grievance. "How much does he know?" Briggs asked. "Everything," Weston said. "He told me last night. He's read the full audit. He knows about the evidence locker. He knows about the traffic stop data. He knows that I was in the meeting where the decision was made to bury the review. He has the audit itself. I don't know how, but he has it." Pruitt was very still against the filing cabinet. "That's why they sent him here," Weston said. "He wasn't sent to review the department generally. He was sent specifically because the AG's office had the audit and needed someone with the legal standing and the will to act on it. We handed him the rest last night." The coffee smell was sharp and stale, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above them, and the 4 men sat and stood in the ruin of the structure they had built, not through dramatic villainy, not through carefully orchestrated conspiracy, but through the slow accumulation of choices that each seemed in its moment like the pragmatic option, the protective option, the option that kept the machine running and found that the machine had been running against the people it was supposed to serve, and that a man who had come specifically to document that fact had been arrested in his own driveway the night before by one of their own officers on camera with his hands up. It was Tom Briggs who broke the specific quality of that silence, not with a solution, but with the practical blunt assessment that was his primary professional skill. So the question is whether you give him what he wants and hope he keeps the audit quiet, or you fight him and lose everything publicly. Those aren't the only options, Dodd said. He had stopped pacing. He was standing at the window looking out at the empty bullpen, and his voice had shifted again. The hollow defensiveness replaced by something that had a different edge to it, a tighter quality. The quality of a man who has thought about something for a long time and has decided that the time for thinking about it is now. Everyone in the room looked at him. 2 years ago, Dodd said without turning from the window, when you and Captain Pruitt had your conversation in Squad Car 12, about how to handle the audit, about the evidence logs. The room went very quiet. You thought the dashcam audio was off, Dodd said. He turned from the window. It wasn't. What happened to Weston's face in the following 3 seconds was not an emotion exactly. It was a physiological sequence, the specific progression of the body responding to information that the mind is still processing the breath, pulling in sharply through the nose, the jaw tightening the slight forward incline of a man whose balance has been compromised by something invisible. Behind him, Dale Pruitt hit the filing cabinet. Not hard, not with force, but his weight shifted backward and found the metal edge of it, and he steadied himself against it with a hand that had gone to the cabinet the way a hand goes to a wall in the dark, instinctively seeking something solid when the ground becomes unreliable. His throat moved. His eyes, which had been so carefully calculating all morning, were wide and unguarded in a way that stripped 10 years of professional composure from his face and left something much less composed underneath. You recorded us, Pruitt said. The words came out slowly, each one placed with the careful deliberateness of a man who cannot quite believe the sentence he is constructing. I checked the car back into the motor pool that night, Dodd said. I found the memory card when I ran the system check. I pulled it. I've had it in a safety deposit box at the Millhaven First National branch on Clement Street ever since. Briggs let out a long, low breath through his nose. The sound was not dramatic. It was the sound of a man recalibrating the slow exhalation of someone who has just understood that the room he is in is significantly different from the room he thought he entered. So here's how this works, Dodd said, and his voice had the particular brittle confidence of a man who has staked everything on a single card and is committed to playing it regardless of what he knows in his gut about the strength of the hand it represents. You don't fire me. You go back to Calloway, and you tell him the terms of whatever agreement he's proposing are not acceptable. And if he releases the audit, I release the dashcam audio of the chief of police and a department captain discussing how to falsify evidence logs. Which means you're not looking at misconduct, Bob. You're looking at federal obstruction. And you're looking at evidence tampering, and both of those carry mandatory minimums. He paused. We understand each other. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked to the glass office door and opened it and walked through, and the door swung closed behind him. And the impact of it in the frame was not quite a slam, but wasn't gentle. Either the sound of a conclusion imposed a period at the end of a sentence spoken by a man who had decided that whatever came next was going to begin on his terms. The glass vibrated slightly in its frame after he was gone. Briggs stood. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at Weston with an expression that was not without something resembling sympathy, but was primarily the expression of a man doing a clean exit calculation. You're on your own, Bob, he said. He left. Pruitt and Weston were alone in the office. The fluorescent light buzzed. The coffee was cold in the pot. Pruitt looked at Weston across the oak desk, and Weston looked at Pruitt and the years of their friendship. The rounds of golf, the departmental politics navigated together. The particular bond of men who have protected each other inside an institution and called it loyalty were present in the room with them, in the way that things you are losing are always most present in the moment of their loss. What are you going to do? Pruitt asked. Weston looked at his hands on the desk. They were trembling finely with the involuntary tremor of a body under sustained stress. Not dramatic, not large, just the specific fine shaking of a man who has been running on adrenaline and no sleep for 9 hours and has now run out of both. I'm going to do what he asked, Weston said, and then I'm going to call my lawyer. Pruitt nodded once slowly. He pushed himself off the filing cabinet. He walked out of the office without another word, and Weston watched him go, and then Weston sat alone in his glass-walled office in the buzzing fluorescent quiet of the empty bullpen, looking at his own trembling hands, and the clock on the wall said 7:31 a.m., and he had 89 minutes. James had not slept much. This was not drama, and he was not interested in dramatizing it. It was simply the ordinary physical aftermath of an extraordinary violation, the body's honest accounting of what had been done to it. His wrists had throbbed for 2 hours after he closed the door. His shoulder, where Dodd had yanked him, had settled into a dull, persistent ache that reminded him of its existence every time he reached for something. The cold metal of the car hood had left no visible mark on his face, but had left something in the muscle memory of his cheek that his pillow kept finding. He was at the kitchen island by 6 a.m. with a cup of tea and a legal pad. He had drawn 3 columns on the first page. The columns were labeled in his careful, precise handwriting: evidence, leverage, exposure. The evidence column was full. The leverage column had 3 items in it each with a check mark beside it. The exposure column was what he was working on now. Not with anxiety, but with the focused, patient attention of a man building something that needs to be built correctly the first time, because there would not be a second opportunity to build it. His phone buzzed at 6:47 a.m. It was a Google alert. He had set alerts for his own name when he took the appointment because public officials who don't track their own press presence tend to be surprised by it at the worst possible moments. He looked at the screen. The alert linked to a breaking news item on the Millhaven Courier-Tribune website, time-stamped 6:31 a.m., flagged as exclusive, as the headline read, "Anonymous police source claims incoming state prosecutor used political connections to avoid arrest, threatens local officers with false charges." James read the article once, beginning to end with the same careful attention he would give to opposing counsel's brief. The article claimed that officers had responded to a legitimate burglary call in good faith that the suspect referred to as the incoming prosecutor without naming him, which was a nicety that would dissolve within the hour, had become verbally aggressive and physically uncooperative. That the political pressure applied afterward constituted an abuse of the prosecutor's position, and that the officers involved were being railroaded by an official using his office as a personal weapon. James set his phone down. He took a sip of tea. He wasn't angry. He was, and he examined this feeling with the same honesty he tried to apply to everything deeply, precisely satisfied. Not with the situation, not with what had been done to him, not with any of it, but with this specific development which confirmed something he had understood about Gary Dodd from the disciplinary file he had read 3 weeks ago. Dodd was a man who could not accept defeat. When cornered, he didn't assess his position honestly and respond rationally. He doubled down. He escalated. He reached for the narrative. The article was a panic move. It was Dodd doing what narcissists in difficult positions always do, which was attempt to control the story before the story could be told by someone else. What Dodd had not understood, could not apparently understand, was that in trying to control the story, he had given James exactly what he needed to tell a much larger one. The text messages between Dodd and the reporter would be obtainable. The article itself, with its timestamp of 6:31 a.m., would be a document in the federal case. James picked up his phone and called Franklin Moore. Moore answered on the second ring, which meant he was already awake and already at his desk, which was not surprising. Franklin Moore had been at his desk by 6 a.m. every working day for 30 years, and he was 61 years old. And he was the reason James had taken this appointment over 2 others that paid considerably better. "You saw the article," James said. 40 minutes ago, Moore said. His voice was the same as it always was, measured warm, carrying the particular unhurried authority of a man who had been through enough that the texture of difficulty no longer surprised him, only its specific shape. "How are you?" "I'm fine," James said. "Your wrists?" "Fine." A pause. "James." Just the name. The way Moore said it when he wanted to acknowledge something without making it bigger than it needed to be. "I know," James said. "I know." Another pause, and then Moore said what he had called to say, which was the thing James needed to hear, not because he didn't already know it, but because hearing it from someone else, someone who had earned the right to say it, made it land differently. You didn't go there to be a martyr, and you didn't get yourself arrested to make a point. What happened to you last night happens to people in that city every week who don't have a law degree and don't have the AG's office behind them. The only difference is that this time it happened on 3 dash cams, and the city of Mill Haven handed the incoming special prosecutor a federal civil rights case on his own driveway 3 days after he moved in. You didn't make that happen. They handed it to you. They did, James said. Do you have what you need? He gave me the rest this morning, James said. The leak to the paper seals it. A brief silence and then more. What do you need from me? Have the federal receivership petition drafted and ready to file by 11. I'll call you at 9:05. He ended the call. He picked up his legal pad and looked at the 3 columns. He thought about Plan A. The quiet one, the months-long audit review, the careful document-by-document case building he had come here to do. He thought about Plan B, which was what last night had become, and he thought about Plan C, which Dodd had activated at 6:31 a.m., without understanding that he was activating it. He was not angry. He was ready. He had been watching from the kitchen window for 10 minutes when Weston's Tahoe turned onto Sycamore Ridge Drive. The chief parked better this time properly at the curb, one wheel on the pavement, but he walked up the driveway with the gait of a man carrying something heavy in a bag he can no longer quite hold at the right height, the slight forward lean and shortened stride of accumulated exhaustion and dread. The manila folder in his hand had been held so tightly during the drive that the corner had crumpled. James opened the door before Weston's hand reached the bell. Weston looked at him. He looked like he had aged since last night, the particular aging that isn't about time, but about what time has held the specific wearing down of a man who has spent the hours between midnight and 9 a.m. in the company of consequences he can no longer manage. He held out the folder. Dodd's termination papers, he said. His voice had the quality of something spoken from a great distance. Signed and time-stamped at 7:50 this morning, and the civilian oversight agreement signed by me and by Mayor Hartwell. We got the mayor on the phone at 6:30. He paused. He swallowed. We met your terms. James looked at the folder. Then he reached into his own shirt pocket and pulled out his phone and held it out to Weston, screen facing forward, showing the Courier-Tribune article. Weston read the headline. The last remaining color in his face completed its departure. I didn't, he started. That wasn't Gary went rogue. I did not authorize that. I had no knowledge of it before it appeared. I woke up to it the same way you did. I know, James said. Weston blinked. I know you didn't authorize it, James said. Gary Dodd made a decision this morning that Gary Dodd is going to own for the rest of his professional life. But the condition of our arrangement was not simply that you provide the paperwork. The condition was full compliance and institutional silence while we prepared the oversight framework. What your officer did this morning at 6:31 a.m., before your ink was dry on those termination papers, was a deliberate attempt to neutralize a federal civil rights investigation by poisoning the press with a false narrative. That is obstruction, and whether you authorized it or not, it happened inside the structure you built. It happened because the culture you ran for 10 years produced a man who thought that was an acceptable option. He took the folder from Weston's hand. He set it on the counter without opening it. The deal I offered you last night, he said, was the best deal available. It isn't available anymore. Weston put a hand on the counter to steady himself. The kitchen was quiet, the refrigerator's hum, the faint sound of the street outside, the thin autumn light coming through the window over the sink and lying flat across the hardwood floor. Please, Weston said. The word came out without its usual architecture. No professional framing around it, no political management. Just the word itself stripped down to what it was, which was a man asking for a mercy that the situation had made unavailable. I gave you everything you asked for. I fired him. I signed the oversight agreement. Higgins, Dodd. Gary, Dodd. He blackmailed me this morning. He told me about a dashcam recording. He has audio of me and Pruitt discussing the audit. He was going to release it if I fired him. I fired him anyway. I fell on my sword. And he leaked the story regardless. You didn't fall on your sword for me, James said. You ran out of options. I want you to understand the difference between those things because the difference matters for what comes next." Weston looked at him. James looked back. "What comes next," James said, "is what I came to the city to do. I have the body cam footage from last night. I have the dash cam footage. I have the audio of Patricia Howell's 911 call. I have the Tillman Haverford audit and 3 years of traffic stop data. I have this article and I have the text exchange between your officer and the reporter that produced it, which my office obtained at 7:15 this morning through emergency legal process. And I have your signed paperwork, which I will be presenting today not as the conclusion of this matter, but as the opening document in the federal oversight case." He walked to the front door. He opened it. The morning was bright and cool, the oak trees carrying their October colors, the street quiet. "I suggest," James said, "that you go back to your precinct, gather whatever you need to gather, and call your attorney. A very good one." Weston crossed the threshold. He stopped on the porch. "Your job was to protect the public," James said from inside the doorway, his voice not raised perfectly level, the same voice he used in courtrooms when he had already won, and the only remaining question was the quality of the closure. "You protected the department instead. That's not a crime of malice, but it is still a crime." He closed the door. The smart lock clicked. The light went green. James stood in his hallway. He looked at his mother's photograph. He looked at it for a long moment. The church clothes, the courthouse steps, the specific smile of a woman who has done something worth smiling about, and then he picked up his phone and called Denise Farrow. "It's time," he said. By 11:45 on a Wednesday morning in the middle of October, the block of Sycamore Ridge Drive between Maple Court and the cul-de-sac at the north end had been transformed into something that bore no resemblance to the quiet, affluent suburb it had been 3 days ago when James Calloway first pulled into the driveway at number 417 with the keys to his new house in his jacket pocket. News vans from 4 Chicago network affiliates and 2 suburban stations had parked along the street's west side, their satellite dishes extended into the pale October sky, their cables running across the manicured lawns in a way that the Homeowners Association would have objected to strongly under any other circumstances. State troopers, not Mill Haven, PTD officers specifically. Not Mill Haven PDD officers had established a perimeter that extended from James's front porch to the street, a quiet jurisdictional statement made visible in high-visibility vests. The podium was set up in the driveway, specifically in the section of the driveway where the patrol car had hopped the curb the previous evening, a detail that was not accidental, and that Denise Farrow, who had arrived at 7 a.m. and spent the morning doing the background reporting that would frame everything that followed, had already noted in her broadcast script. The neighbors were on their porches. All of them this time not the cautious emergence of the night before porch lights flickering on, one by one, but the full frank presence of a residential community that understood it was witnessing something that would be talked about. The man in the cardinal sweatshirt who had told Patricia Howell's neighbor to keep filming. The couple from the White House on the corner who had watched from their doorway and said nothing. The woman 2 doors down who had sent James a handwritten note at 8 a.m., slipped under his door, no name, just, "We should have come out. I'm sorry." And Patricia Howell. She was on her own porch across the street in regular clothes. This time, no quilted robe, no binoculars, no phone, visible anywhere on her person. She was standing very still, her arms folded across her chest, watching with the expression of a woman who has understood that the story she told herself about her own role in recent events is not the story that is about to be told in public. At 12:05 p.m., James Calloway walked out of his front door. He was wearing a charcoal suit, not black. Charcoal, the specific shade of a man who dresses with precision, who understands that presentation is communication, and has chosen his communication carefully. White shirt, no tie. The open collar of a man who is at ease in this moment, who is not dressed up for an occasion but simply dressed as himself. He walked down his porch steps, the same steps where he had stood 14 hours ago with his hands raised and a spotlight in his face, and he walked to the podium and he stood at it and he looked at the cameras and the reporters and the neighbors and the state troopers and the November morning, and he was completely, utterly still for 3 full seconds. No cough, no shuffle of papers, no adjustment of the microphone. Just stillness offered to the assembled cameras, a stillness that was not emptiness but presence. The specific presence of a man who knows exactly where he is and exactly what he is about to do. "Before I address what happened at this addresses last night," he said, and his voice came through the outdoor speakers with the resonance of someone trained to fill rooms, "I want to tell you about 3 people who live in this city." A reporter at the front of the press pool lowered her pen. Darnell Shaw is 34 years old. He works as a licensed electrician out of a shop on Birch Avenue in Millhaven's East District. Over the course of 18 months, beginning in the spring of 2 years ago and ending last March, Mr. Shaw was stopped by Millhaven police officers 11 times while driving in his own neighborhood. He was cited on none of those occasions. He was arrested on none of those occasions. When I asked him this past Monday what impact those stops had had on his life, he told me that he stopped driving his own car to work. He takes the bus now, which adds 40 minutes each way to his commute, because the anxiety of a traffic stop in his own neighborhood had become larger than the inconvenience of the alternative. The press pool was very quiet. Renee Baxter is 58 years old. She is a retired schoolteacher who taught 6th grade at Lincoln Elementary in Millhaven for 27 years. 14 months ago, she was detained in the parking lot of a grocery store on Clement Street for 40 minutes by a Millhaven officer who questioned her reason for being in the parking lot. She was waiting for her daughter to finish her shift inside the store. She has not returned to that store. Her daughter drives to a store in a neighboring municipality now. A camera operator in the second row had stopped moving. Everyone was still. Troy Ellison is 19 years old. He was a sophomore at Millhaven Community College. On the night before his first college-level calculus exam, he was pulled over on Route 9 North, placed in handcuffs, and detained on the side of the road for 2 hours before being released without explanation, without charges, and without apology. He did not take his exam the next morning. He transferred out of Millhaven Community College 4 months later. James let those 3 names, Darnell Shaws, Shayashi, Renee Baxter, Troy Ellison, sit in the morning air for a moment. "These are not statistics," he said. "These are not data points in an audit. These are people who live in this city and whose lives have been altered by an organized, entrenched pattern of law enforcement conduct that has operated in this department for years, documented internally and deliberately suppressed." He paused. 3 days ago, I moved into this neighborhood to begin my tenure as Special Prosecutor for the Illinois State Attorney General's office with a specific mandate to investigate law enforcement accountability in the greater Millhaven metropolitan area. A murmur moved through the reporters. Last night, while attempting to fix a malfunctioning lock on my own front door, this door here 3 feet behind me, I was racially profiled, physically assaulted, and placed in handcuffs on my own property by officers of the Millhaven Police Department. A driver's license in my pocket at my current address was confiscated and never examined. I was pressed against the hood of my own vehicle, and the officer who did it said on audio that is now in the possession of the FBI, "These guys always have a story." He reached to the side of the podium and a state technician activated the screen behind him. The body cam footage played. Uncut, unedited. From the moment the spotlight hit James on the porch to the moment the handcuffs closed, 13 minutes and 42 seconds in high definition with full audio playing through outdoor speakers on a quiet suburban street while the street's residents watched from their porches and 4 Chicago news stations broadcast it live. Patricia Howell across the street stood very still. The 911 audio played next Howell's voice, precise and identifiable, describing a man picking the lock of a house she knew was vacant, her tone carrying the specific register of someone who has already decided who the guilty party is and is providing the emergency services only as a formality. Then, the Courier-Tribune article appeared on the screen, full text, time-stamped 6:31 a.m. And immediately beside it on a split screen that several reporters stepped forward to see more clearly, The text message exchange between Gary Dodd and the Courier-Tribune reporter obtained through emergency legal process at 7:15 that morning showing the deliberate and coordinated leak of a false narrative to the press. Officer Gary Dodd, James said, did not simply arrest an innocent man on his own property last night. He then attempted to use the press to destroy the federal investigation that man was sent here to conduct. That is obstruction of justice in addition to the civil rights violations, and it will be treated accordingly. He held up the Tillman Haverford audit, the full-bound copy, 143 pages, its cover visible to the cameras. This document was completed 2 years ago by an internal review team of this police department. It details the entrenched pattern of racially disparate traffic stops I described a moment ago. The stops that touched Darnell Shaw, Renee Baxter, and Troy Ellison, and hundreds of others. It also details the theft of $38,000 from the department's narcotics evidence locker orchestrated by Captain Dale Pruitt and covered up by Chief Robert Weston. The press corps erupted. James raised his voice over it, not loud but clear. The voice of a man who has been in courtrooms when things go loud and has learned that clarity is more powerful than volume. Effective immediately, I am filing federal civil rights charges and criminal battery charges against Officer Gary Dodd. I am transmitting the Tillman Haverford audit and all supporting documentation to the FBI's Public Integrity Division. And I am filing an emergency petition with the Illinois Supreme Court to place the Millhaven Police Department under federal receivership pending a full, independent review. He looked out at the street. 3 black FBI Suburbans were rolling slowly onto Sycamore Ridge Drive from the north end. The cameras caught them. James looked back at the main broadcast camera, the one with the red recording light and the station logo on its side, and he said with the perfect quiet of complete conviction, "No one is above the law. Especially not the people who are paid to enforce it." He stepped back from the podium. He walked back up his porch steps, the same door, the same smart lock that had started all of this, and he went inside. The door closed behind him. The lock glowed green. The Suburbans reached the precinct at 12:47 p.m. There were 3 of them, black and deliberately unremarkable. The kind of vehicle that announces itself not through drama, but through the specific quality of its deliberate absence of drama. No lights, no sirens. Just 3 large, dark vehicles rolling at a measured pace down the street that led to the Millhaven Police Department's main entrance, parking in the visitor spaces that face the building's front windows. Inside the precinct, the officers on day shift watched them arrive through the windows of the bullpen, the way people watch a storm come in from a clear sky, with the particular stillness of those who have been told something is coming and have found that knowing it was coming did not make the moment of its arrival any easier. The federal agents walked in through the front door at 12:51 p.m., presented their credentials to the desk sergeant with the quiet efficiency of people who have done this many times and understand that efficiency is its own kind of authority, and asked for Chief Weston and Captain Pruitt to be produced. Weston was in his office. He had been in his office since returning from James's house, sitting at his desk, not working, not calling anyone, not doing any of the things that the habits of a 30-year career would normally have organized him to do. He had been sitting with his hands flat on the desk in the fluorescent quiet of the room that still smelled of the morning's burned coffee and waiting for what he had known since 9:05 a.m. was going to happen. He stood when the agents came to his door. He put his jacket on the gesture of a man maintaining form even in the absence of function, and he walked out of his office and through the bullpen, and the officers on shift watched him go, and he did not look at them, and they did not look away. The handcuffs went on in the parking lot. The sound they made was the same sound, the same mechanical ratchet, the same precise tooth-by-tooth click that had been on the body cam footage playing on television screens across Millhaven for the past 45 minutes. Pruitt came out 7 minutes after Weston, escorted by 2 agents, and the sight of the captain in handcuffs produced in the cluster of officers watching from the bullpen windows a silence of a particular quality. Not satisfaction, not sorrow, but the specific stunned quiet of people watching an assumption they have held for a long time prove itself false. At 3:47 p.m., 2 federal agents knocked on the door of a house in the Millhaven suburb of Glendale Heights, 12 miles from Sycamore Ridge. Gary Dodd answered the door himself. He was in civilian clothes, jeans, a gray Henley. The unremarkable off-duty clothes of a man who had been home since 7 that morning since Weston had taken his badge and weapon in the driveway of 417 Sycamore Ridge Drive, since he had driven home in his personal car and gone inside and sat in his kitchen and watched the news coverage begin to build and told himself each successive hour that he had the dashcam audio, that he had leverage, that it was going to be okay. The agents presented the arrest warrant. Dodd looked at it for a moment. His wife appeared in the hallway behind him. A woman in her mid-30s, a kitchen towel in her hand, her expression immediately understanding something about the presence of 2 federal agents at her front door that she had not been told, but had perhaps been waiting on some level to be told. His 2 teenage children were home from school. Dodd put his hands behind his back. The handcuffs closed. It is worth noting, and the body cam on the arresting agent noted it, the sound they made, because it was the same sound, the same mechanical precision, the same cold authority that Dodd's own handcuffs had made on James Calloway's wrists in the driveway 14 hours earlier. The symmetry was not poetic. It was simply accurate. It was the sound of the law operating without preference for who it found. Dodd did not resist. He did not perform outrage. He walked to the federal vehicle with the agents, and he folded himself into the back seat, and the door closed, and the vehicle drove away from the house on the quiet Glendale Heights street, and his wife stood in the doorway with the kitchen towel still in her hand, watching. Ryan Cole had not waited to be called. At 7:30 that morning, an hour before Weston's arrival at James's door, 2 hours before the press conference on his own initiative without being told to and without consulting anyone, Cole had driven to the Illinois AG's field office in Millhaven, presented himself at the front desk, given his name and badge number, and asked to speak with someone from Special Prosecutor Calloway's team. He had been shown to a conference room, and he had spent 90 minutes giving a complete and voluntary account of everything that had happened the night before, from the dispatch call to the drive to Sycamore Ridge to the moment Weston appeared and took Dodd's badge. He did not minimize his own role. He did not excuse it. He said, "I didn't stop it. I should have stopped it when he didn't look at the ID. I knew something was wrong and I didn't say anything, and I want that in the record." He was placed on administrative leave pending the broader federal review. He was 26 years old. There was still in that particular piece of information something that was not quite hope, but was in its neighborhood the suggestion that the story was not entirely fixed, that some of the people inside these institutions were capable at cost to themselves of choosing accountability over loyalty when the moment required it. Patricia Howell's name appeared in the Courier-Tribune online edition at 4:15 p.m. Not in an article about her specifically, but in the full reporting on the civil rights case in the context of the 911 audio that had played at the press conference with her name identified by 3 separate neighbors who had spoken to the paper's reporters on background. By evening, 2 civil rights organizations had contacted James's office with information about a pattern of similar 911 calls originating from the Sycamore Ridge neighborhood over the preceding 5 years. Patricia's curtains were closed. They would remain closed for a long time. There is a kind of information that lives in a file folder in a government office that should not, by any reasonable standard, be allowed to remain only in a file folder. It should have names. It should have faces. It should have the specific human texture of the people it describes, because when it remains only in a folder, it remains abstract, and abstract is what allows it to persist without consequence. James's case files contained 3 names that the press conference had made public and that deserved to be more than footnotes in a federal audit. Darnell Shaw was 34 years old and had been doing electrical work since he was 19, learning the trade from his uncle the way James had learned to use a flathead screwdriver in a driveway with patience, with the understanding that knowing how things work gives you a kind of authority that no one can revoke. He had built a client base over 10 years. Residential, mostly some commercial. He drove a work van with his business name on the side, and he had been proud of that van in the way that people are proud of things they have built themselves from a beginning that did not make it easy. The first stop had been a Tuesday evening in April 2 years ago. He was driving home from a job in the Millhaven West district, his tools in the back, his business cards in the glove compartment. The officer said he had been driving erratically. He had not been cited for driving erratically because he had not been driving erratically, but the stop had taken 22 minutes and had included a request to exit the vehicle, a request to open the back of the van, and a thorough examination of his tools by an officer who explained that the tools were consistent with burglary implements. He filed no complaint. The second stop, the third, the seventh, each with its own variation, its own specific sequence of implied accusation and demanded explanation, and ultimate release without charges, without apology, without acknowledgement that anything irregular had occurred, accumulated in Darnell's life. Not as discrete incidents, but as a single continuous message delivered repeatedly that the street between his home and his work was not neutral territory for him. He started taking the bus in February, 40 minutes each way. He told James on Monday in the conference room at the AG's field office, sitting across a table with his hands folded in front of him and the specific contained composure of a man who has decided that the people asking him questions deserve honest answers, but that he is going to deliver those answers on his own terms and at his own pace. "I'm not angry. I was angry for a long time. Now I'm just tired of it taking up space in my head." Renee Baxter had taught 6th grade for 27 years. She had taught children who grew up to be nurses, 2 who became lawyers, 1 who was currently an alderman in a Chicago suburb. She had taught children whose parents had struggled and whose circumstances had been difficult, and who had needed someone to tell them consistently over the course of an entire school year that they were capable of more than they had been told, and she had been that person repeatedly for nearly 3 decades. She was waiting for her daughter in a parking lot. Her daughter worked the closing shift at the grocery store on Clement Street. The officer had approached her vehicle, asked what she was doing there, asked how long she had been there, asked why she hadn't gone inside the store, asked for identification, examined the identification for an extended period, returned it, and then remained beside her vehicle in a manner she described as making sure I understood he could stay as long as he wanted. Her daughter came out 45 minutes later. Renee did not go back to that store. Her daughter now drives to a store 20 minutes away in a different municipality because that is what you do when the closer option has been made to feel unsafe in a way that you cannot explain to someone who has not experienced it, because the explanation requires the listener to believe something about how the world operates that some listeners find easier not to believe. Troy Ellison had been 19 years old, newly enrolled at 18. Millhaven Community College, driving home from his girlfriend's apartment on a Tuesday night in September on Route 9. North, the particular quality of Tuesday night in September that belongs to people at the beginning of things. The semester just started the calculus class harder than he expected the exam the next morning. He had been studying for all weekend. The stop lasted 2 hours. He was handcuffed for 90 minutes of those 2 hours. He was given no explanation. No charges were filed, no citation was issued. The officer who released him said, and these words appeared in the Tillman Haverford Audit's complaint appendix because Troy had been the one person out of the dozens of similar cases who had actually filed a complaint, "You're free to go." He did not take his exam. He called his mother from the side of the road at midnight. He transferred out of Millhaven Community College that spring and enrolled at a school in a different county 30 miles away, adding an hour and 15 minutes to his commute because the jurisdiction of the Millhaven PD did not extend 30 miles east, and the hour and 15 minutes felt compared to what he had carried since September like freedom. These 3 stories: Darnell's bus commute, Renee's parking lot, Troy's Tuesday night on Route 9. North were not the whole of what the Tillman Haverford audit documented. They were 3 out of hundreds that had been given specific human shape by people willing to step into a conference room and say their names and say what happened and say what it had cost them. James read their files that evening after the press conference after the federal arrests in the kitchen of his house that still smelled of cedar and paint, and he thought about what his mother had told him once standing in the kitchen of her apartment in Evanston, stirring something on the stove. Not looking at him, the way she delivered the things she most wanted him to remember, as if saying them directly would give them too much weight, and she wanted them to land lightly enough that he would carry them without strain. She had said, "The people who get to fight back have an obligation to fight back for the ones who didn't get the chance." He had become a lawyer because of 2 bus stops. He had become a prosecutor because of Darnell Shaw's van and Renee Baxter's parking lot and Troy Ellison's calculus exam and all the people like them whose names he didn't know yet, whose files he hadn't read yet, but who existed in every city, in every jurisdiction where accountability had been buried in favor of protection and who deserved someone who had been watching from day one. The street was quiet by 8 p.m. The news vans had gone packed up and driven off in the mid-afternoon, their satellite dishes retracted, their cables wound and loaded, leaving behind only the small rectangular imprints in the grass where their equipment had rested, and the memory in the minds of the neighbors who had watched from their porches of a Wednesday that had been unlike any Wednesday the street had seen before. James was in his kitchen. The legal pad was on the island. All 3 columns were full. Each entry had a check mark or a notation beside it, and the notations were small and precise, and the handwriting did not waver, which was not a matter of effort, but of the specific quality of exhaustion that lives on the other side of enormous effort. Completed not the shaky exhaustion of the defeated, but the flat, quiet exhaustion of the accomplished. His tea had gone cold. He made another cup. He stood at the kitchen island and looked at his mother's photograph on the wall opposite. Estelle Calloway, in her good church clothes on the steps of the courthouse in Chicago. The dark blue dress, the white gloves, the hat with the silk flower. She was smiling at whoever was holding the camera, James, as it happened, who had been 17 years old and whose hands had been steadier than his understanding of the moment, which had not fully arrived until years later. She had been on those courthouse steps because she had just watched her son argue his first civil rights case, a moot court competition technically, but in a real courtroom, before a real judge who had given up a Saturday morning to serve as adjudicator, and James had won it, and his mother had been in the gallery in her best dress as if it were a Sunday, which to her it essentially was. She had worked as a hospital orderly for 31 years. She had been stopped twice by police in their home city. Once walking to work at 5:30 in the morning in her work clothes, carrying her lunch. Once waiting at a bus stop on a February evening after a double shift in the cold in the dark, just waiting for the bus that would take her home. Both times she had been polite. She had shown her ID. She had answered the questions. She had not filed a complaint either time because filing a complaint had seemed in the specific geography of her life, and the specific weight of what she was already carrying like a use of energy she did not have. She had not been bitter about it. This was the thing James had not always understood, and then had come over years to understand completely. She had not swallowed bitterness and called it acceptance. She had genuinely assessed the situation, the resources available to her, the likely outcomes of various responses, the cost-benefit of fighting something that felt from inside it like weather. And she had made a practical decision, and she had continued to move through her life with the particular grace of a person who has decided that the things done to you do not get to define the shape of you. What she had given James was not bitterness. She had given him direction. She had said, "You don't get to be ordinary, so be extraordinary." Not as pressure, not as demand, but as simple fact delivered with the matter-of-fact specificity of a woman telling her child something about the weather. Bring an umbrella. The forecast says, "Rain here is what the world requires of you." It was the most loving thing anyone had ever said to him, and the most accurate and the most useful. He had become a lawyer because of her 2 bus stops. Not in anger, in intention. He stood in his kitchen and looked at her photograph, and he thought about the handcuffs, the cold metal, the click of each tooth, the red malfunction light blinking above him on his own front door, and he thought about Dodd saying, "These guys always have a story." While holding a driver's license he had never bothered to read. And he thought about Weston saying, "I thought I was a good cop," with the genuine despair of a man who had simply slowly over years made the wrong thing his first priority. He thought they handed me everything, not with triumph. The thought arrived with the quiet, specific weight of a thing that is simply true, true in the way that certain facts are true, not dramatically, not with fanfare, just with the solid permanence of something that has always been the case and has now been confirmed. He had come here to find the evidence. He had found it the way his mother found her way home from the bus stop, by moving through the thing without letting it change the direction of travel. He picked up his tea. He took a sip. He looked at the photograph. He said to no one in particular in the quiet kitchen of the house that was becoming slowly the place he lived, "I know, Mama, I know." 6 months is not a long time in the usual run of institutional change. Most reforms move on the timeline of patience, years of pressure, decades of advocacy, the slow grinding work of people who understand that the machine does not change quickly and who show up anyway again because someone has to. 6 months is usually barely enough time to get the paperwork in order, let alone to see the paperwork become practice. But federal receivership operates on a different schedule than voluntary reform. When the Illinois Supreme Court granted the emergency receivership petition on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the press conference on Sycamore Ridge Drive, the Millhaven Police Department came under the authority of a federally appointed oversight committee with full independent review capacity, subpoena power over all departmental records, and the authority to mandate operational changes within the department without requiring the consent of the department's internal leadership. The interim chief was a retired FBI supervisory agent named Leonard Graves, who had run similar oversight programs in 2 other states and who had the specific useful quality of a man who is unimpressed by the arguments that institutions make for why they should not have to change. By mid-November, the traffic stop data had been published in full. The numbers confirmed what the Tillman-Haverford audit had found in the 6 municipalities of the Millhaven metropolitan area. Black drivers were stopped at a rate 4 times higher than white drivers, with citation rates that did not proportionately reflect the stop rates. The data went back 4 years. It was precise and detailed, and once public, impossible to explain away with the usual vocabularies of police procedure and officer discretion. The Courier-Tribune published it in full. The Chicago papers picked it up. The story moved. By December, the Illinois AG's office building on the Millhaven case had identified 3 other departments in the state where similar patterns existed in traffic stop records and evidence handling procedures. Reviews were opened. Audits were scheduled. The specific institutional silence that had allowed those patterns to operate for years was interrupted not because the institutions had chosen to interrupt it, but because someone with the authority and the evidence had made the alternative unavailable. In January, the Illinois legislature passed what became known in its official version as the Residential Verification Protocol Act. Unofficially, in the press coverage, in the law enforcement training materials that followed, in the testimony before the legislative committee that heard the bill, it was called the Callaway Protocols. The legislation required that before an officer made physical contact with an individual during a residential call, the officer must make a reasonable attempt to verify the individual's connection to the property, checking the reported address against available identification, querying property records if necessary, and documenting the verification attempt before initiating physical contact. The standard was not complicated. It was not burdensome. It was, in essence, the 2-second review of a driver's license that Gary Dodd had declined to perform on a Tuesday evening in October, written into state law. Applied to every department in Illinois. Named in the testimony of the 2 legislators who co-sponsored it after what had happened on Sycamore Ridge Drive. James had been asked to testify at the committee hearing. He had accepted. He had sat at the witness table in Springfield in the same charcoal suit he had worn to the press conference, and he had spoken for 12 minutes, and he had spent exactly 2 of those 12 minutes on what had happened to him, and 10 of them on Darnell Shaw, and Renee Baxter, and Troy Ellison, whose names he used with their permission. Because their stories were not data, and they were not statistics, and they were not footnotes in an audit. They were the reason the law was being written, and they deserved to be at the center of it. The requirement was not complicated, but it was real, and it existed because of a battery that died in a smart lock on a Tuesday evening in October, and a man who had been paying close enough attention to understand what had been handed to him. Gary Dodd was convicted on 3 counts in federal court on a March Tuesday in a proceeding that lasted 4 days and produced no surprises. The body cam footage, the dash cam audio, the text message, exchange with the reporter, and the testimony of Ryan Cole constituted an evidentiary case that Dodd's defense attorney addressed with the limited tools available to a man defending the indefensible, which is to say, not effectively. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal custody, permanent revocation of all law enforcement credentials in the state of Illinois, a lifetime bar from holding any position of public trust. The federal judge in her sentencing remarks noted that the case was not primarily about Gary Dodd, that Dodd was in her characterization the visible symptom of a deeply embedded institutional culture that protected its own at the expense of the public it was chartered to serve, and that the sentence reflected both the severity of the specific offenses and the pattern that had enabled them. His wife filed for divorce during the trial. Their 2 teenage children were not in court for the sentencing. The dashcam footage from Dodd's own body came the footage he had never imagined would be used against him. The footage of him pressing the special prosecutor for the Illinois AG's office against the hood of a car, while the man's driver's license was in his pocket, became through a process that contained its own particular irony, a mandatory training film at the Illinois State Police Academy. New recruits watched it in their first semester, not to see something exceptional, to see something that had happened because the ordinary safeguards of good judgment and basic procedure had been bypassed, and to understand concretely what bypassing those safeguards looked like, cost, and produced. Robert Weston pleaded guilty in February to 1 count of obstruction of justice and 2 counts of official misconduct in a negotiated resolution that reflected his cooperation with the federal investigation into the evidence locker theft and the traffic stop data. He was sentenced to 3 years probation, stripped of his pension, and permanently barred from holding public office in Illinois. At sentencing, he read a prepared statement. It was not long. The relevant portion was 11 words. I protected the institution instead of the people it was built to serve. He was not asked to elaborate. No elaboration was required. Dale Pruitt did not cooperate. He was indicted on 4 counts of evidence theft and 2 counts of conspiracy to obstruct justice, and his trial was scheduled for the following autumn. He faced 8 to 12 years if convicted. Patricia Howell was named in a civil lawsuit filed by James's office on behalf of Darnell Shaw, Renee Baxter, and Troy Ellison, a suit that documented a 5-year pattern of racially motivated emergency calls from the Sycamore Ridge area, of which her 911 call on October 14th was one example among 11 documented incidents. The lawsuit was pending, and its outcome was not yet determined, and James was careful not to predict it. What was determined was this: Patricia Howell put her house on the market in February. The listing was at a price 12% below the neighborhood average, which the listing agent framed as motivated seller, and which the neighbors understood in the way that the neighbors always understand things that are not said outright. She was gone by March. The house sold to a family with 2 young children who put a welcome mat outside the front door and planted something in the front bed that would bloom in spring. The neighborhood did not miss her exactly, but several people, including the man in the cardinal sweatshirt and the woman who had slipped the note under James's door, reflected privately on the fact that they had known for years the specific quality of Patricia Howell's neighborhood watch reports and had never pushed back on them, had understood on some level what assumptions were driving them, and had said nothing, and that this silence had been its own kind of participation in what those reports had set in motion. Ryan Cole was reinstated in April following the federal review of his conduct. He was assigned to the department's newly established Community Relations Division, a unit created as part of the receivership requirements staffed by officers who were required to complete an extended community engagement curriculum before deployment. He was 27 years old. He had chosen accountability over loyalty at cost, and without certainty about what it would cost him at a moment when the easier choice was silence. He was not celebrated for this. He was, to the extent that such things can be measured, simply a young man who had done what should have been done from the beginning, and who had the rest of a career to build on that foundation. That seemed to James like enough. It was an April evening, one of the first genuinely warm ones of the year, the kind of evening that arrives after a long winter and reminds you in the specific language of warmth on skin and the smell of earth waking up that things end and things begin, and the calendar, indifferent as it is, keeps both of those facts in honest sequence. James was on his porch. He had a cup of tea. His good tea, the loose-leaf Assam that he ordered from a shop in Andersonville, and that he reserved for evenings when he wasn't working evenings, when the legal pad was in the drawer and the phone was on silent, and the evening had no assignment except to be an evening. The street looked different from the porch now compared to October. Not different in its physical facts. The same oaks, the same driveways, the same porch lights coming on at dusk, but different in the way that places look different once you know them. Once you know the names attached to the houses and the stories inside the names. The man in the cardinal sweatshirt was named Gerald, and he had 3 grandchildren who visited on weekends. The couple from the White House on the corner were David and Miriam, and they had lived on this block for 22 years and had watched many things happen on it, and had Miriam told James over coffee one Saturday in November, not always been proud of how much they had simply watched. The woman who had slipped the note under his door was named Frances, and she had called him one evening in January and said that she had joined the newly formed Millhaven Citizens Oversight Board as a civilian member, and James had said, "Good for you, Frances," with complete sincerity. He had not met Patricia Howell before she left. There had been no occasion to. He did not know whether he would have wanted one. He set his tea down on the porch railing. Above him, the smart lock glowed green. It had not malfunctioned since October. It was doing what it was designed to do, monitoring, registering, confirming that the door was locked and the home was secure, performing the quiet, reliable function of a system operating as intended. He had moved his mother's photograph. It was now on the wall just inside the front door, the hallway wall directly facing the porch, so that when he sat out here in the evenings and looked through the glass panel beside the door he could see her. The church clothes, the courthouse steps, the smile. He had told Franklin Moore about moving the photograph on one of their regular check-in calls, and Moore had said she'd have something to say about all of this, and James had said she'd say I took too long. And Moore had laughed, a genuine warm laugh, the laugh of a man who had known James long enough to know that the joke was also an admission, and James had laughed too. His phone was on the porch railing beside his tea. He had set it face up on silent because he was not working this evening, but because 3 specific people had said they might reach out. The first call had already come that morning. Darnell Shaw had called James's office, not the emergency line, not the case file number, just the main office number, and left a message with the assistant. James had listened to it twice. Darnell's voice was the same as it had been in the conference room in October, measured, even carrying the particular compression of a man who has learned to say important things economically. The message was 30 seconds long. He said that he had driven his own van to work on Monday for the first time since February of last year. He said it the way you say a fact, without drama, without announcement, just the honest reporting of something that had happened that he thought someone should know about. James had played it twice. The second message was a card in the physical mail which almost no one sent him anymore, which made its arrival on his desk on a Tuesday the previous week something he had looked at for a moment before opening. It was from Renee Baxter. It was the kind of small square note card that comes in boxes of 20 with a simple floral border, the kind you find at the drugstore. Inside, in neat schoolteacher's cursive, "Thank you for saying our names." He had put it on his desk, not filed, not in a case folder. On his desk where he could see it when he was working. The third was Troy Ellison, who had called 3 weeks ago, not about the case. The case was ongoing, and they were careful about direct contact during that period, but through James's assistant, who had passed on the message with a note that said simply, "He wanted you to know." What Troy wanted James to know was that he had re-enrolled, pre-law, at a school in a different county 30 miles from Millhaven, but he was enrolled and the semester was going well, and he thought James should know. James sat on his porch in the April evening, and he held his tea in both hands, and he looked at the street and the oaks and the porch lights coming on one by one down the block, and above him the smart lock held its steady green, and the photograph inside caught a last piece of light through the glass. He thought about October. He thought about standing on these same steps with his hands raised and a spotlight in his face and a screwdriver on the railing and the particular controlled quality of his own pulse. In that moment, the deep, deliberate breathing of a man who understands that the next few minutes are going to require everything he has learned about how to be in the world without letting the world's worst moments change the direction of travel. He thought about the handcuffs. He thought a battery died. And then a battery died and Darnell Shaw drove his van to work. These two facts were connected in the way that many things are connected that do not appear to be through a chain of events and choices and consequences that nobody had planned for, that nobody could have predicted in full, but that had moved in the direction of things getting better rather than worse, which was not guaranteed, was never guaranteed but was possible, was always possible when someone who could fight chose to fight for the ones who couldn't. He took a sip of his tea. The street was quiet. The lock was green. He was home. Here is what this story is really about. It is not about a man with a law degree and a government title, though it contains one. It is not about a conspiracy, or a dramatic revelation, or any particular piece of luck, good or bad. It is about the ordinary Tuesday evening that became the rest of something. The ordinary malfunction of battery, a blinking red light that sat at the beginning of a chain of events that changed the law of the state of Illinois. It is about the fact that what happened to James Calloway on his own porch in October had been happening to other people in that city for years, without dash cams, and without the AG's office, and without anyone who could stand in the driveway afterward and recite Fourth Amendment law in a voice that cut through the night air like something that had been sharpened for exactly this purpose. Darnell Shaw didn't have that. Renee Baxter didn't have that. Troy Ellison didn't have that. What they had was the truth of their own experience, which is not. Nothing, it is never nothing, but which in the specific geography of how institutions protect themselves is often not enough by itself. This is why the story of James Calloway matters beyond James Calloway. Not because he was powerful. He was by the time of October 14th a person with institutional power, that is true. But the power did not protect him from being handcuffed on his own property. The power did not prevent the spotlight or the cuffs or the cold metal of his own car hood against his cheek. What the power gave him was the ability to do something with it afterward, to convert the experience into evidence, to take what had happened to him and use it precisely and completely on behalf of the people who had experienced the same thing without the ability to convert it. That is what prepared people can do. That is what people who have spent their lives building toward something. Building the knowledge, the legal standing, the patient, deliberate competence can offer to the people who have the experience, but not the tools. James Calloway waited through the entire night of October 14th and through the early morning and through the slow, grinding hours of preparation with the legal pad and the 3 columns and the tea going cold and the phone buzzing with a false narrative designed to undo what he was building. He waited because he understood that the moment he called the world's attention to what had happened, it had to be undeniable. He waited until the evidence was complete. Then he called. And if you have stayed with this story until its end, if you waited through all of it, through the porch and the handcuffs and the chief's office and the press conference and the April evening and the green light, then you already understand why it matters. You have already felt what justice feels like when it works the way it is supposed to work, which is slowly, which is with evidence, which is on behalf of the people who needed it most. That is what this channel is for. Story by story, we bring you the moments when the truth was bigger than the fear of it. Subscribe to our channel because the next time a story like this needs to be told, we want you to be there to hear it. This story is a fictional dramatization created for entertainment and educational purposes. All characters, names, locations, organizations, and events depicted are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real persons living or dead or to actual events is purely coincidental.